Hello, handsome. You know, there are times in life when we have to ask ourselves difficult questions. Questions like, what is that beautiful house? Or where does that highway go to? Or even, will everyone be mad at me if I show up to the wedding in a suit this big? The answer is yes. This video is part 4 on the channel series on the history of punk music and specifically New Wave. Even though it's part 4, I make all of my videos standalone so you don't have to go watch the other 3 in order to understand this one. Let me know who your favorite New Wave artist is in the comments down below, and let's get started. Oh, and I will also drop a link in the description for a Spotify playlist that has all the music played in this video. So what is New Wave? New Wave was a genre that was born out of that initial 1970s punk movement that came about in the late 1970s but also moved somewhat parallel to punk. The name New Wave was actually derived from the French cinema movement of the same name that came about in the late 1950s. However, the music genre in the 1970s and 80s was mostly British and American. And honestly, have the French ever made a film as good as whatever the hell Devo were doing? I didn't think so. Checkmate, France. New Wave followed punk's lead in the belief that anyone could start a band, and in fact, many of the groups we're going to talk about formed around the same time as, or even before, the more pure punk bands at the time. The groups in this genre would also expand on a lot of the fashion and aesthetic choices happening in punk rock. New Wave also shares a lot of similarities to post-punk in the fact that they can actually share a lot of the same bands. I think the main difference, though, is that post-punk tends to be darker and more brooding, while New Wave ends up being more colorful and pop-oriented. Out of all the subgenres that we cover in this series, though, I think New Wave is probably the most far removed from punk rock. Punk's spirit was fiercely opposed to the mainstream and despised anything to do with pop music. At least that's what they advertised. New Wave, on the other hand, ran headfirst towards the mainstream and embraced everything pop. Many of the artists in this genre had dreams of revolutionizing the radio and creating the sound of the future. And that's where it really separates itself from other subgenres. These groups wanted to be played on the radio and on TV. They wanted to be the next big thing. And granted, there were punk bands like the Ramones that wanted to take over the world. However, New Wave artists made this goal their North Star. It was this drive and the abandonment of the fear of selling out that allowed these artists to rule the 1980s. And that tied into the sound of New Wave. The artists cared less about the ferocity of punk rock and instead leaned harder into more accessible pop music. They would also blend more genres into their music, such as funk, disco, or Afrobeat, that would help them expand far past the limitations of the punk genre. Most of these groups also incorporated way more electronic elements like synthesizers, which led to its association with synth pop. It's also important to note that New Wave as a genre is so broad that it's almost impossible to tie everything together. Almost all of the artists at the time rejected the New Wave label, so it's hard to pin down exactly what New Wave was. Over the course of the video, though, we're going to be able to flesh out what New Wave was and how it fit into the punk canon. I am also going to put a huge disclaimer here. I will not be covering every single New Wave artist because this video would be like 3 hours long. I'm going to talk about New Wave as a genre and how it fits into the overall musical landscape and choose bands here and there and how they tie into the New Wave genre. And that is why I have constructed this nifty chart that will help us break down the genre. I've tried to somewhat put it on a timeline, but some artists had some activity before or after their respective place on the chart. Also, some of these bands could fit into multiple boxes, but I put them where I think they tie in best. This is not a hard and fast guide, but more so something to help us flesh out a really diverse and broad genre. We may not get to every artist in a specific grouping, but I wanted to include them for the sake of acknowledging them. With all that being said, let's go forward and move ahead into the video. So starting out, I want to talk about some of the influences outside of punk that made New Wave so different from other genres. I've dubbed this section Proto New Wave, and it includes artists and genres that were important to New Wave that happened before its peak in the 1980s. New Wave obviously had influences from like punk rock and the krautrock influences like Kraftwerk, but the influences that really separate it from other genres are the glitzier sounds of the 70s. New Wave artists really embraced disco, and those rhythms would find themselves incorporated into a lot of the artists we're going to talk about. The disco group Chic specifically would be hugely important to the New Wave sound. They also went nuts over the glam bands of the 1970s, with artists like T-Rex or Ziggy-era David Bowie playing a huge role in the fashion and character of New Wave. There was one band, though, that would play a crucial role into what New Wave would become. And in fact, one of its members is responsible for a lot of the music in post-punk, New Wave, and No Wave. Let's talk about Roxy Music. Roxy Music are a British band that got its start in the early 1970s and played a major role in the glam rock scene. Their music was characterized by singer Bryan Ferry's deeper singing voice and distinctive vibrato, and much of their early sound would be shaped by the help of one of its prolific members, their synth player Brian Eno. Brian Eno is one of the most important figures in all of modern music, and I'm being dead serious. He played on Roxy's first 2 albums, then went on to define the ambient genre, produced David Bowie's Berlin trilogy, produced albums with U2, was instrumental in the no-wave genre by putting together one of the few recordings we have of that scene, and as we get into it, produced big names in new wave. He is one of my favorite artists of all time, and actually my tattoo is from one of his albums. His unique synth playing was incredibly influential to those in the new wave genre. He would leave Roxy in 1973 after growing differences with Bryan Ferry, but would play on their first 2 albums. Roxy Music and Bryan Ferry, Eno aside, would play a major role and inspire pretty much every band we're about to talk about. Okay. Now we're going to get into the actual new wave bands, and we're going to start with the American pioneers of the 1970s. These pioneer sections definitely bleed into the 1980s, but the groups in these sections had a lot of importance in the 1970s. So we're going to start with the band Devo, who is interesting. They're one of the groups in this video that have explicitly stated their love for Roxy Music, and Brian Eno had actually produced their first album. When they got their start, they were more interested in making like the sound of the future and had a very like geeky, synth-heavy image. They were really experimental starting out and would frequently like mess with their audience by doing stupid antics. One of my favorites is that early on they couldn't get gigs, so they would just like pretend to be a cover band. They would get on stage and be like, here's another one by Foghat, and then start playing their own stuff. They rejected punk's disdain for the mainstream, but were also cynical of the rock elitism at the time, which led to their futuristic sound. They're actually a really political band and touch on all sorts of abstract topics, but most people only know them as that 1980s group with the funny hats. Their first album is what I think the best entryway to get into their music. However, their most popular was their third album, Freedom of Choice, that came out in 1980 that featured their biggest hit, Whip It. There's something to be said about Devo that you can actually say about a lot of the artists in this video. You'll probably notice this as we get along, but a lot of the music in new wave is very prominent in pop culture and in pop music. And a lot of these groups are written off as like goofy one-hit wonders, and a lot of their music has been played to death on the radio or in fucking hotel commercials. But below the very surface level understanding we have of them, they have very deep roots into our culture as a whole. A lot of these artists' lesser known works have gone on to influence a lot of different artists that came after them. The other really notable pioneers for new wave out of America came out of the CBGB scene and played along artists like the Ramones and Patti Smith. Talking Heads and Blondie both formed in 1974 and were regulars at the famous CBGB before they became 2 of the biggest bands in the world. Starting with Talking Heads, they are one of the most critically acclaimed bands of all time and have influenced countless acts that came after them. They're one of those artists that really like walk the line between new wave and post-punk and show just how blurry that line is. Simon Reynolds, in his book Rip It Up and Start Again, goes on to explain what puts them more into the new wave category though, with, quote, "In the early days, Talking Heads' skinny sound seemed to slot right into the skinny tie mold of new wave bands like XTC and the Cars. The new wave template consisted of choppy rhythm guitar with hardly any lead playing, fast, ungroovy tempos, and often keyboards. The vocals tended to be high-pitched, geeky, and very white. The songs often had stop-start structures and melodies that were angular and jumpy rather than gently curving. This would be especially true on their debut, but on their next 3 albums, which were all produced by Brian Eno, yes, there's Eno again, they expanded their sound and really came into their own. They would take heavy influence from funk music and put a new wave flair on it. Remain in Light, released in 1980, would be the last in this trilogy and saw the band exploring Afrobeat and African rhythms inspired by Fela Kuti. Many consider this to be their defining work and would spawn one of their most widely known songs, Once in a Lifetime, which has one of the best music videos of all time. 1983 would see them hit the peak of their career, though, when they released their album Speaking in Tongues, which had their only top 10 hit in the States, Burning Down the House. released their concert film Stop Making Sense a year later, which features David Byrne in his iconic big suit dancing and running full speed around the stage. A24 picked up the rights to the film and released it in 4K in 2023, but there's a special edition DVD coming out this year for its 40th anniversary if you want to check that out. Talking Heads made a name for themselves in the CBGB scene, but they would come up alongside another group that would blow them out of the water in the mainstream, Blondie. Blondie is a group that started out pretty rough around the edges and would make a name for themselves more in the UK than in the US at first when they became regulars on Top of the Pops. Short tangent because I don't think I've discussed it on the channel yet, but for my handsome Americans out there, Top of the Pops was a weekly TV show that would host a lot of the biggest acts at the time. Artists would perform one of their tracks live for audiences at home. And I put that in quotations because Top of the Pops insisted that artists would mime and lip sync along to their songs, which a lot of artists had a problem with, but it was just part of the show. Top of the Pops would play a major role in the glam scene, with David Bowie's and T-Rex's early 1970s performances being incredibly influential to young people in the UK. Basically, if you could get on Top of the Pops, you were in the big time, and it was a chance for you to get even bigger. So it was a big deal that Blondie were mainstays on that show. However, their album in 1978, Parallel Lines, would make them a household name in America. Parallel Lines would cement Blondie as the most successful band to come out of the New York CBGB scene when it went to the top 10 on Billboard. It showed the world that those out of the punk scene could compete in the world of pop. The disco-infused single Heart of Glass off the album would hit #1 on Billboard and would also be their first #1 hit in the UK. This album would kick off Blondie to be one of the most successful bands of all time. Their ability to fuse genres really put them above everyone else, and they were not afraid of going disco. In fact, they would work with the father of disco, Giorgio Moroder, to write their hit single Call Me for the film American Gigolo. Call Me would be the #1 single of 1980, which really shows how important Blondie is to pop music. They quite literally kicked off in the 1980s. Their peak was in 1980, and they would actually end up breaking up in 1982, but their legacy is undeniable, and they also got back together in the late 90s. Debbie Harry, in particular, is an iconic figure, and when people bring up prolific women in rock music, she's usually one of the first to get brought up. Gwen Stefani and Miley Cyrus are two people in particular who have taken a clear influence from her. I'm also realizing we're probably going to have to move through this a little bit quicker. We're going to be here like all day. Also out of America were groups like the B-52s and the Cars, and the B-52s we're going to talk about more towards like the end of the video, but the Cars were massively popular. The Cars' self-titled debut in 1978 is often considered one of the best rock albums of all time. The album features the stripped-down sound of punk, but infused with more pop and even some electronic elements. They were much like Blondie in that they have quite a few top 40 hits under their belt. Moving on to the British pioneers of New Wave, we have to talk about Elvis Costello. Elvis Costello is an odd figure in that he wasn't really that tied to punk rock, but does owe his popularity to the movement. He's a really nerdy guy who took more influence from like the Beatles and the original Elvis, but had a lot more angst behind him. He'd been playing for a while before he got big because now he was able to share an audience with those in the punk movement. His album Armed Forces in 1979 would break into the top 10, but it was the album before it, This Year's Model, released in 1978, that would spawn one of his most iconic songs, Radio Radio. Radio Radio is a critique of the commercialization of radio at the time, and so it resonated with a lot of young people. This album would also be his first to feature his new backing band, The Attractions. Costello early on was a really rebellious figure, and I think that's why punks really took a liking to him in the 1970s. One of his most well-known moments was in 1977 when he went on SNL and went against the script to play his song Radio Radio, which was not on the set list. This would actually get him banned from SNL until the late 1980s.
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, there's no reason to do this song here. Radio Radio.
Another British group that would inspire a lot of 1980s new wave artists, and actually a lot of bands in the 90s, was XTC. XTC were certainly more popular in the UK than they were in America, but they carved a name for themselves as some of the best songwriters of the time. They didn't really take to the punk movement at the time, as they took far more influence from groups like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, so they were way more interested in pop music. Their songs featured the raw sound of punk rock with some quirkier studio choices, but everything always boiled down to a pop sensibility. They would gain some popularity on their first more like post-punk albums, but their third album, Drums and Wires, in 1979 showed them evolving in the songwriting they would become known for. This would be a far more accessible album from the group and would get them their first top 40 hit in the UK with Making Plans for Nigel, a song about overbearing parents planning their child's future in British steel. XTC would continue to have a lot of success in the 1980s and never stopped experimenting. And honestly, when I think of British New Wave in the 1970s, XTC is like the first band I think of. Around the same time as XTC, there was another pioneer who was paving the way for New Wave, but in a much more glamorous style. Adam Ant got his start with Adam and the Ants and was originally managed by Malcolm McLaren before Malcolm stole the members from his band to form Bow Wow Wow. His first album with the Ants, which was Dirk Wears White Socks, released in 1979, was far more post-punk in sound and aesthetic, but after McLaren stole the members of his band, Adam dove headfirst into pop, which was what he wanted to do all along. Adam Ant, whose real name is Stuart Goddard, got most of his influence from the punk movement and the glam groups of the 1970s. One of his biggest contributions to New Wave and the bands he inspired was his looks. His getup had pieces from pirates, Native Americans, and the British military. He would really break out onto the scene in the UK when he released his album Kings of the Wild Frontier in 1980 and Prince Charming in 1981, which were both released with the new members of the Ants. These albums would make Adam Ant a teenage heartthrob and blow him up to superstar status, and these would be the albums where he really refined his sound. They took heavily from glam rock but introduced tribal rhythms that matched Adam's visuals, and they were of course dressed up in true pop fashion. He would continue to have success in the UK, but it wasn't until he dropped his band and went solo as Adam Ant that he got his success in the US. His album Friend or Foe, released in 1982, was his biggest yet and featured his first hit single in the US, Goody Two Shoes, which was part of a movement that would define the 1980s. A movement made up of British artists invading American television. These pioneers in the 1970s showed what really defined New Wave. They had a strong connection to punk rock, whether that be through their origin, their influences, or their attitude. The only difference is that they all had a desire to make it in the pop world and didn't care about the limitations set by punk's code of honor. They had their own way of doing things, and that would prove to be what allowed them to take over the radio. So the UK was a really important part of New Wave. However, I'm American, which means that everything is about me. And that's why I decided to split up the timeline, with half of it happening before 1981 and half happening after. There were other important events happening in 1981, but this year would be when the music industry changed forever. This was when MTV officially launched on American televisions. MTV transformed how artists interacted with their audiences and would shape American culture all throughout the 1980s. It certainly owes its success to artists like Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna, but it was the British New Wave bands that gave the channel its identity in the beginning. This is really showcased by the fact that the first music video played on MTV was a New Wave song by a New Wave band. Video Killed the Radio Star by British group The Buggles was released in 1979, but got the honor of being the first music video on MTV in 1981. Members from this group, like Trevor Horn, would go on to do other big things in the New Wave genre, but they would ultimately kickstart the revolution of music television in America. MTV also helped usher in something in America that was coined the Second British Invasion. Well, it's technically the third if you count, The first British invasion was in the 1960s when groups like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks were getting really big in America. The second British invasion refers to when a lot of British acts were getting really big in America in the early 1980s, with its peak happening around 1983. Many British artists would dominate the American charts, with a particular week in July of 1983 being made up of majority British acts on the Billboard Top 10. A lot of the biggest acts at the time either came from or were inspired by a specific underground movement that was happening in Britain around the year 1980. This is the story of the New Romantics. The New Romantic movement was a subculture that came out of London and consisted of artists, musicians, and regulars of the Blitz nightclub. The culture was known mostly for its androgynous fashion and combined the flashiest parts of glam with an affinity for 19th century British clothing. The scene had a strong LGBTQ presence, and this played heavily into the identity of the movement. Not everyone out of the movement identified under that umbrella. However, it was thanks to that community that we have a lot of the fashion and art that was a staple of the 1980s. The Blitz nightclub, where most of this was coming out of, opened in 1979 and was a hub for the New Romantics. The regulars of this club worshipped artists like David Bowie, with his album Heroes in particular being a favorite. Blitz was pretty short-lived as it closed in 1981. However, a lot of the artists that came out of this scene would continue to have a lot of success afterwards. The New Romantics were important because they were the innovators that inspired much of the fashion and music that a lot of 80s New Wave was known for. One of the earliest musical contributions to come out of this scene was put together by the owners of the Blitz as their group Visage. Their track Fade to Grey in 1980 never made a splash in the US but did well in Europe and had a video that showed the potential of the scene. The group that was really first to make big waves out of the New Romantic scene, though, was Spandau Ballet. They combined the synth sounds of the future with Sinatra-style vocals and definitely had an aim to redefine pop music. They had a really heavy presence at Blitz and were one of the first to put a musical formula to the eccentric fashion. Their debut single was To Cut a Long Story Short, which captivated Britain in 1980, but they wouldn't score a hit in the US until 1983 with their song True, which actually went into the top 40 on Billboard. Those of you out there who work retail can't get enough of this one, I'm sure. These next two groups that we're going to talk about were arguably two of the defining bands on MTV, and they both came out of the New Romantic scene. And the first one we're going to talk about was actually Princess Diana's favorite band. Duran Duran weren't actually Blitz kids, but were part of an adjacent movement in Birmingham. They were also the first to acknowledge the term New Romantic in lyrics for their song Planet Earth, which they played on top of the Pops and would go to number 12 on the UK charts in 1981. Duran Duran were a group that were directly inspired by artists like Roxy Music, the punk rock genre, and also disco groups like Chic. They would very quickly become heartthrobs in the UK before turning their attention to America and would find tremendous success with their second album, Rio. Rio, which was released in 1982, found the band enjoying international success and would score them multiple top 40 hits in the US. The album would garner praise from artists like Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson and showed the band arriving as pop sensations. Duran Duran would continue to be incredibly successful throughout the 1980s. They were featured heavily on MTV and were part of that second British invasion. And as much as I love their music, all I can think of when I hear Hungry Like the Wolf is that scene in Big Fat Liar where they turn Paul Giamatti blue, which I'm sure was the intended purpose of that song the entire time. The third group that I want to talk about from the New Romantics was a group that actually got its start around the time that the Blitz nightclub closed down. Culture Club was formed in 1981 with singer Boy George, who was a regular at the Blitz Club, and the group had a tremendous amount of success in the early 1980s thanks to their soulful new wave sound. Right from their debut album, Kissing to Be Clever, in 1982, they had international success when their single Do You Really Want to Hurt Me blew up in both the UK and in the US. Do you really want to hurt me? Many of Culture Club's biggest songs were about the intimate relationship between Boy George and their drummer, John Moss. I think that aspect lends to their songs having a lot of emotional depth and is one of the reasons behind their success. Their second album, Color by Numbers, released in 1983, would be their biggest yet and featured multiple top 40 hits, with Karma Chameleon being their only number one hit in the US and their second number one hit in the UK. Culture Club and Boy George are probably the best example of the new romantic movement being exposed to an American audience. They would be featured heavily on MTV, and when I surveyed 80s historians, my mom, who were around during their heyday, she remembers them being a staple on the channel. By the time some of these other groups got to America, they had kind of toned down some of their fashion and more flamboyant aspects. But Boy George stepped out repping the Blitz Kids right from the start, and this led to a lot of people emulating him and getting a taste of this underground movement from across the pond. Culture Club are definitely one of the groups that I think of when I think of 80s New Wave. So around this time, there were a few groups that many critics were keeping tabs on and who were showing a lot of potential at the turn of the decade. At this point going forward, there's going to be a lot of labels thrown around that all pretty much refer to the same thing. New Wave, new music, synth pop, and in particular, new pop was a term that was being thrown around in critic circles at the beginning of the 1980s. You have to think at this time, music trends were just moving super quickly. And the year 1980 was the beginning of an exciting new decade with a lot of new technology and potential rolling in from the 1970s. So new pop was an indication of where things were heading. This term, new pop, was really used to describe a new movement in the 1980s where groups had a desire to bring a punk sensibility to pop music and reshape the mainstream. Paul Morley, a British music journalist, really championed this new movement, and from everything I can find, the origin of the term new pop traces all the way back to him in a specific piece he wrote in NME in December of 1980. This article would highlight 3 bands that Morley felt were the next big thing going into the 1980s. Okay, so here's the thing. This article was really important in the scope of music journalism and also in me researching this video. I looked everywhere for this thing online and just could not find it. So I actually went out and found the original paper for when this thing came out. This is the year-end 1980 issue of NME featuring that article, and I was able to pull from it directly. But there's a catch. The 3 artists that I thought he wrote about are not the ones that he wrote about. The 3 bands in the article are Essential Bop, Restricted Code, and ABC. The problem is, Essential Bop and Restricted Code didn't go on to do pretty much anything, but ABC did. And there are 2 other artists that are mentioned in this article that we are going to talk about because they were just as hyped as the other groups, the Human League and Orange Juice. Let's start with the Human League. The Human League formed in 1977 and dropped their debut album in 1979 with frontman Philip Oakey and had a clear desire to make futuristic music. Already from their first couple of singles, they were starting to get co-signed by bigger artists, with David Bowie saying they were going to be the future of pop music. Their synth pop styling sounded like the 1980s when they were still firmly at the tail end of the 1970s, and they made a name for themselves in clubs around Europe, playing shows with the likes of Iggy Pop and Susie and the Banshees. Not at the same time though, could you imagine? They didn't have a ton of commercial success until they released their album Dare in 1981. Dare showed a true arrival for synth pop in the 1980s. With their 2 new members, Joanne Catherall and Susan Ann Sully, they went all in on making a pop record. They'd taken a lot of influence from Gary Newman, but the chemistry they had with their new members allowed them to create a synth pop classic. This album would blow them up in the UK and US and featured their first Billboard #1, a song that would get extensive play on early MTV and 2000s era Swiffer commercials, Don't You Want Me? The band that actually did show up in the Morley article, though, was ABC. The band ABC, fronted by Martin Fry, was touted as one of the next big pop groups by critics. They were quintessential new pop in that they wanted to reshape the radio and be one of the biggest acts in the world. Right off the bat, they wanted to make music that was far more polished and grandiose than other pop music that was coming out at the time. This is another group that was really inspired by the New Romantics, and sonically you can make a lot of comparisons to Spandau Ballet. Their crowning achievement was their debut album, The Lexicon of Love, which was a smash hit in the UK. It blended the sounds of disco and Frank Sinatra, but with a huge modern twist, and featured songs like Tears Are Not Enough and Poison Arrow. The album has beautiful production thanks to Trevor Horn. Horn is one of the members from the Buggles I was talking about earlier that would do big things in the new wave scene. This album is one of my personal favorites from researching this video and has aged like a fine wine. ABC's greatest legacy is that they showed a lot of the ambition that a lot of the artists in this era were known for. You can tell just from the music that they were not afraid to go big or go home. And hey, Paul Morley got 1 out of 3 right. I'd say that counts for something. The last band in the new pop realm that we're going to talk about The last band that we're going to talk about in the new pop realm is one that came out of what people call the postcard bands. Postcard Records was a super small label that was out of Glasgow, Scotland, that published mostly Scottish artists. Groups like Joseph K, Aztec Camera, and Orange Juice. There were a lot of eyes on Orange Juice early in their career, which would have been the late 1970s. They were far less electronic in their approach and took more influence from groups like Buzzcocks, the CBGB bands, and Chic. Their sound is closer to what people refer to as jangle pop, which is the same umbrella that a band like The Smiths are under. They didn't really have the same success that like The Human League or ABC had. However, I think I enjoy their music the most out of the three bands. Their second album, Rip It Up, which came out in 1982, was far more ambitious than their debut and played heavily with funk and disco rhythms. The title track was their only top 10 hit in the UK, but it at least gave them a drop of the success they had set out for. Okay, so we haven't really touched on this yet, but many of these artists' influences and formula came from black genres, and there aren't exactly a lot of black figures in new wave. Much of the music that we're talking about in this video and in this series as a whole wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the black artists that were innovating in the first place. I think this passage from Simon Reynolds in Rip It Up says it best with, quote, "The backstory to new pop was actually a black story. African-American innovations in rhythm, production, and arrangement, Chic, P-Funk, the Michael Jackson/Quincy Jones sound, the New York electro and synth funk of the early 80s had been assimilated by the perennially quicker off-the-mark Brits and then exported back to white America. That's why the American press heralded the 1983 breakthrough of what they called new music as the second British invasion, a repeat of what happened in the 60s when the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks sold their version of rhythm and blues to white American teenagers. Someone I want to highlight who did make a name for themselves but would actually go on to expand into the greater pop sphere in the 1980s is Grace Jones. Grace Jones is one of the most unique figures in music history, and her work has gone on to influence artists like Beyoncé in the modern age. She got her start as a model before becoming a staple in the disco scene at Studio 54. She started off making disco records in the 1970s before going into a more new wave direction in the 1980s. I think she's the best example, honestly, of somebody from the disco scene fully embracing new wave music. Her critically successful 1981 album Nightclubbing showed a lot of the versatility that new wave was known for. The title of the album and the title track is from a cover of Iggy Pop's song off of The Idiot. It also features this song Demolition Man, which was written by Sting from new wave band The Police for Grace Jones. The album, thanks to Jamaican rhythm duo Sly and Robbie, mixes elements of reggae, dub, and disco and is a perfect example of the new wave sound emanating from a black artist. Strange. I've seen that face before. Grace Jones would go on to do a lot of things outside of new wave, but really embodied the genre at the beginning of the 1980s. She would actually go on to work with Trevor Horn, see there's Trevor again, in the mid-1980s. Okay, so I think this next part is going to be what a lot of people will have clicked on this video for. I've split up the 1980s new wave bands into the more electronic and then the more rock-oriented groups for the sake of organization. Synth pop itself is a pretty loose genre. It's really used to describe the pop groups that were using a lot more electronic elements that were getting popular in the late 70s, early 80s. You could honestly spend forever trying to categorize bands into new wave or synth pop or both and just not get anywhere. I'm focusing more on groups that had more direct ties or influence from punk. Groups like Japan or Ultravox actually played a heavy role in what inspired many of the synth pop groups. But one man in particular played a heavy role in the more electronic side of new wave. Gary Newman. Gary Newman started his career with the group Tubeway Army in the late 1970s, but would fly solo after just a couple albums. He was initially influenced by punk rock before falling in love with synthesizers and drum machines. He states that in the beginning, all he was doing was just turning punk songs into electronic songs. He released Tubeway Army and Replicas with Tubeway in 1978 and 1979, respectively, but he found a lot of success on his solo debut, The Pleasure Principle, in 1979. The tracks Our Friends Electric off of Replicas would top the British charts, and Cars from The Pleasure Principle would give him another #1 single in the UK and his only top 10 hit in the US. Newman's cold and robotic image was a huge part of his appeal. He's also a great example of someone who's a one-hit wonder in the US but would be hugely important outside of his own music. The rest of the groups we're going to talk about owe a lot to him, and many of the industrial groups in the 80s and 90s hold him up as a saint. This next group we're going to talk about already showed up in my last post-punk video. Kinda. New Order rose out of the ashes of the post-punk group Joy Division. After their singer Ian Curtis took his own life, the rest of the group reformed as New Order, and after some trial and error, made a new sound all their own. They started out pretty much as just like a continuation of Joy Division, but their goal soon became to make more electronic music that brought people to the dance floor. They obviously kept a lot of their influences from krautrock like Kraftwerk, but they started to incorporate a lot more disco into their DNA. Their most iconic work is easily the 1983 track Blue Monday, which is a Frankenstein of disco and other electronic influences put together using some of the most state-of-the-art equipment at the time. New synths, new drum machines, and a new sampler. This is one of the most important tracks to come out of the 1980s, and its impact can be felt in much of the electronic and dance music that came after it. This one track has a tremendous legacy, and even today, it is the best-selling 12-inch single of all time. Their album Power, Corruption, Lies, which came out 2 months after Blue Monday, is a personal favorite of mine. It's so much lighter than their work as Joy Division that you wouldn't even know was basically the same band. This album was their full transition into their new wave sound, and I think they perfect the dance elements that they strived for. When I was a 10-year-old loser, I watched a lot of VH1 Classic. And on that channel, there was a series called The 100 Greatest Songs of the 80s. That series was my first exposure to a lot of the artists that we're talking about, and even today, I blame it for what my life has become. These next few groups were featured on that series and are artists that a lot of people associate with 80s culture. Soft Cell, Flock of Seagulls, and Eurythmics are all groups that were featured on early MTV and got heavy play on the radio in the early 80s. I think when a lot of people think New Wave, these are the groups that come to mind more than anyone else. They brought an electronic edge to pop music that was really exciting and new at the time. Soft Cell, whose cover of the Gloria Jones song Tainted Love would be another example of a group that was a one-hit wonder in the United States, but would be incredibly popular in their home country of Britain. Flock of Seagulls, a British group fronted by a hairstylist, if you couldn't tell, had a heavy new romantic slant to their image and sound, while the Eurythmics, fronted by the iconic Annie Lennox, took a darker approach to synth pop. Their eerie pop hit, Sweet Dreams, would be a massive hit, and the band proved to have some longevity in the 80s beyond some of their contemporaries. These groups would be staples on early MTV and were part of that second British invasion. These next two groups definitely went for like the darker side of synth pop, and this first one that we're going to talk about is one of my personal favorites that I grew up listening to thanks to my dad's CD collection. Depeche Mode formed in 1980 in Essex and played much different music from what they would become known for. They took a lot from the New Romantics at first with their own brand of dance pop, and some of their earliest hits would show the potential of how far the band could go in the pop world. Right from their debut album, they scored a top 10 hit in the UK with Just Can't Get Enough in 1981. 3 years later, their album Some Great Reward showed the band diving further into the more industrial sound that they were beginning to develop. This would be their biggest album at this point and showed them arriving on the American stage. It would be much more mature, and I believe it was this album that cemented their longevity far past some of their new wave contemporaries. The lead single People Are People gave them their first top 40 hit in the US. We're going to talk about Depeche Mode more towards the end of the video, but I definitely want to end this with one of the most popular groups of the 80s, Tears for Fears. Tears for Fears is a British band that made a huge splash right out the gate. In the beginning, they were heavily inspired by artists like Gary Newman, Talking Heads, and Joy Division. Their debut album, The Hurting, in 1983 was a darker concept album about childhood trauma, which actually did extremely well in the UK. It hit #1 on the charts and spawned 3 top 10 hits, with the single Mad World being the soundtrack for depressed 80s teens and even more depressed 2000s Jake Gyllenhaal. They would ride high off of this success before going for the gold. Over the next 2 years, they honed their sound and developed a project that was much more grand and polished than their debut. Songs from The Big Chair, released in 1985, was far more accessible and less dark than their debut, which allowed them to become international stars. Songs from The Big Chair was a tremendously successful album that blew up in the UK, the US, Canada, New Zealand, and other parts of the world. It stayed at #1 on Billboard for 5 weeks and spawned 3 top 10 hits thanks to their heavy rotation on MTV. This album would show just how important New Wave was, and that it wasn't just some passing fad that would fizzle out in a couple of years. Next up on the chart, we're talking about Donkey Kong Country. Next up on the chart, we're talking about Bananarama. Much like Gang of Four in the last video, I didn't really know where to stick this band, so they get the honor of getting their own section. Bananarama formed in London in the early 1980s with members Sarah Dallin, Karen Woodward, and Siobhan Fahey. The group had a mutual interest in artists like Patti Smith, Roxy Music, and Sex Pistols, which led to them running in a lot of the same circles as other punk rock disciples. Their name was actually taken from combining the words banana, which they thought sounded tropical, and the song name Pajamarama by Roxy Music. In their early days, they worked as backup singers for other groups while also writing their own material. Bananarama is an interesting band that combines a lot of the appeal of new wave and synth pop, but wrapped up in the classic girl group formula. They were never put together by a management group, however, as they would form naturally on their own and write their own songs. They made a splash in the UK before going international in 1984 thanks to the release of their hit Cruel Summer, which shook American audiences with a little help from being included in the movie Karate Kid. Cruel Summer and Karate Kid actually tie more into another phenomenon that was happening in New Wave in the 1980s. It wasn't just MTV and Top of the Pops that were blowing these artists up. A lot of these artists would get their songs into big movies at the time, which would expose them to a new audience. It goes to show just how prevalent New Wave was in every facet of culture. Bananarama would also be known just as much for their fashion as for their music. 2 of the members actually met while studying in the London College of Fashion, and this aspect would lend itself to their style. Everything from the hair to the pantsuits gave them an image all their own. The group would be massively successful throughout the 1980s with multiple hits, and they are one of the most successful all-girl groups of all time. This next section I've dubbed Rockin New Wave for the fact that they leaned more into the conventional rock and punk side than the synth pop groups. Again, this is a category I made myself in order to organize the video and is not recognized historically as a term. Definitely think more guitars and drums than synths and drum machines. These are groups that are new wave in that they were directly influenced from punk rock, but focused more on pop songwriting, but had a little harder of an edge to them. The first group we're going to talk about is The Police, a British group that got their start in London in 1977. They are one of the best-selling artists of all time, known for their seamless blend of punk rock, reggae, and pop. The members, Sting, Andy Summers, and Stuart Copeland, were set apart, however, by being extremely competent musicians. Their songs are characterized by intricate polyrhythms, literary references in their lyrics, and Andy Summers' sharp reggae-inspired chord progressions. They have strong punk roots, but one of the funny things about them is that their signature blonde look was actually because they were hired to play a punk band in a commercial and the hair color just stuck. Their 5th studio album, Synchronicity, released in 1983, was their final record before they broke up in 1984 and is easily their most successful. It spent 17 weeks at #1 in the US, and its lead single, Every Breath You Take, was their only #1 hit in the US, spending 8 weeks in that position. The videos from this album had a heavy rotation on MTV, which also marked them as a significant part of that second British invasion. This album also features the song Wrapped Around Your Finger, which is my favorite Police song, and the video is so good. I also have to mention that The Police were like the second concert I've ever been to when they had their reunion tour, and I remember like every moment of it. Elvis Costello actually opened for them, which it's kind of cool that I can get to say that I saw Elvis Costello also. Next on the list is the group The Pretenders, which is a hybrid American-British band that had a lot of success in the 1980s. The origins of the group start when American frontwoman Chrissie Hynde moved to London in 1973 and shortly after had some association with either The Clash and The Damned. She would soon set out to form her own band in 1978 and she put together The Pretenders. They would hone their skills for a couple years before releasing their self-titled debut in 1980. The Pretenders featured the more stripped-down sounds of punk rock, and a lot of the album sounds much more 50s or 60s rock and roll, which differed greatly from some of the other groups in this video. It would also have the honor of being the best-selling album on the UK charts in 1980. The third single off the album was Brass in Pocket, which features Hynde's signature spoken word delivery and would be a part of MTV history as it was only the 7th video featured on the channel at that point. This next group, much like Bananarama, was an all-girl group that found themselves getting hit after hit in the 1980s. The Go-Go's are a group that formed in 1978 in LA, a city that was home to more hardcore bands like the Germs. The Go-Go's took much of that punk influence and dressed it up in bubblegum pop, which gave them an edge over a band that had members named Darby Crash and Pat Smear. Probably not hard, honestly. They had most of their success in the early 1980s, but that success really started when they released their album Beauty and the Beat in 1981. Beauty and the Beat has a number of accomplishments, but one of its most notable is that it is the first #1 album written and performed by an all-female group. This album has since gone on to be multi-platinum and is now a staple in the New Wave catalog. It features one of the best pop songs ever written, Our Lips Are Sealed, which, doesn't it just make you want to run head first into LA traffic? The final artist I want to talk about in this section is the legendary Billy Idol. Billy Idol is a punk icon that got his start in the London-based punk band Generation X in the late 1970s. He came up in the burgeoning punk scene before moving to New York City and making it big in America. One of his goals when he went solo was to combine dance music and punk rock. Almost immediately, he made a name for himself with songs like Mony Mony and Dancing with Myself, but found even more success on MTV. His theatrical edge gave him a leg up, and he had at the perfect time to capitalize on the newfound interest of music videos. He had multiple hits throughout the 1980s, but to me, his most iconic song is White Wedding, which was released on his self-titled debut in 1982.
It's a nice day for a white wedding.
New Wave would continue to stay successful throughout the latter half of the 1980s, but definitely wasn't as strong as it was in the first part of the decade. The late 1980s saw a greater interest in massive R&B figures like Whitney Houston, the beginnings of hip-hop in the mainstream, and the two genres that would eventually put the nail in the coffin for New Wave: hard rock and hair metal. The late 80s saw a huge demand in those last two genres, with artists like Def Leppard and Warrant getting a lot of airtime on MTV. A new wave artist that would embrace the more hard rock transition that was happening in the 80s was INXS. INXS started out in Australia in the early 1980s with a much stronger new wave appeal that was similar to a group like the Cars. They would work to build a name for themselves throughout the 80s before releasing their biggest album to date, Kick, released in 1987. Kick showed a real transition that was happening in the late 80s of quirky synth lines being replaced by pounding guitars and more masculine sex appeal. This album would spawn multiple top 10 hits and foreshadowed much of the hard rock that we would see in the 1990s.
I'm lonely. Can't think at all.
A lot of new wave artists would continue to stay relevant in the late 80s, with groups like Duran Duran and Bananarama even getting more hits, but there was one group in particular that saw their peak at the end of the 80s. The ridiculously fun and eccentric B-52s. The B-52s had actually got their start in Athens, Georgia in the 1970s and had a slow and steady career throughout the 1980s with one or two successful singles here or there. In the beginning, they would actually go on to influence artists like Boy George or the Bangles, but their peak success happened in 1989 and 1990. In 1989, they released their album Cosmic Thing, which showed a lot of what made the B-52s so special. It was their first album back after losing their beloved guitarist Ricky Wilson to the AIDS epidemic in 1985. Much of the material is incredibly upbeat, cheerful, and conjures a party vibe, which is shown in the biggest hit of the band's career, Love Shack. I think it's important to note that the LGBTQ identity of the band can be felt through much of their music and their music videos. I'm actually going to go ahead and drop a link in the description for a really good video essay on how the Love Shack music video ties into LGBTQ film history that you should definitely check out. Oh, also just a fun fact, I actually got the name for my channel from the lyric in Love Shack, Jukebox Money. I was struggling to find a name for the channel at first, and that lyric is what inspired Jukebox history. By the time the 90s hit, New Wave was almost completely out the door. The B-52s kind of got the last hurrah at the end of the decade. However, there's another release that happened in 1990 that I definitely want to bring up, and it's the one we're going to close out the video with. Depeche Mode had continued to stay relevant through the late 80s, but really hadn't released anything since 1987. This would change when the group released what many consider their magnum opus, Violator, in 1990. This would be the band's biggest album up to this point and set them up for a very successful career in the 1990s. The band had steadily gotten darker with each release but continued to have a real pop sensibility. Violator began to abandon a lot of the more lighthearted new wave flair the band was known for in the beginning of their career and instead showed a fully matured sound that they would build on throughout the 90s. This album also foreshadowed the trend of moodier music like grunge or industrial rock that would characterize much of the 90s.
Words are very unnecessary. They can only...
And that's it, baby. That was a brief history of the new wave genre. This will absolutely end up being my longest video at this point, so if you're watching this outro, I really appreciate you watching this whole thing. Doing this video, I realized that I actually have a deep love for new wave music, and I found myself returning to groups like the B-52s and Orange Juice. I ended up adding more and more to this video that, it just ends up happening, so I hope that it was somewhat thorough. Part 5 of this series is going to be on no wave, which will come later rather than sooner, just so I can work on other videos for the channel, but I definitely hope you stick around. I might end up doing some other genre videos in between now and then also. All that being said, thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Peace.